of memorial for the Holocaust. In Israel, where I come from, this is an official Memorial Day. No entertainment, no movies, no concerts, no theater, some shops are closed, some restaurants are closed. You feel it on the street that it's a Memorial Day. And most of all, the siren. At 11 in the morning, there is a 2-minute siren where everything stops. If you are walking on the street, you stop. If you're driving a car, doesn't matter where, freeway, highway, street, you stop. You get out of the car and you stand. 2 minutes later, the siren stops. Everything begins moving again. This, of course, cannot happen here. No way. But we would very much like to begin a tradition of a Memorial Day on this date, not April 19th. It happens to be April 19th. The official date is on the Hebrew calendar, the 27th day of the month of Nisan, which is today. And you would like very much to have this a tradition. We are what is called in the literature CS, child survivors. We were all children during the Holocaust. But you don't need to take a very good look at us now to see that we're not children anymore. So who knows how long we can organize this. We hope that the next generation will continue the tradition. And now I would like to call to the podium Professor Todd Endelman, Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Michigan, who will be our keynote speaker. I'm honored to call Professor Endelman. Please.
I'm very honored to be asked to speak today. 67 years have elapsed since the end of World War II. The Jewish landscape, the Jewish world, has been utterly transformed during the war and in the decades since. East European Jewry, which was the great wellspring of so many other Jewish communities, essentially is no more. Central European Jewry and West European Jewish communities are shadows of their former selves. And the centrality in the Jewish world, hegemony, has passed to the Jews of North America and Jews in the land of Israel. During this period, there has been much discussion within the Jewish community about how to engage the history of the Holocaust, how to deal with memories, how to represent the Holocaust physically in terms of memorials, educationally, and there's been much discussion as well about what the legacy, lessons or whatever of the Holocaust are. Now during this very, very passionate discussion, it's been going on for now at least a half a century, some persons have expressed fears that the world will forget and that every year, with fewer survivors alive able to provide first-person testimony, that knowledge of what happened will become weaker. The fear is that the history of the Holocaust, the memory of it, its consciousness, is linked directly to the testimony of those who experienced. There is also the fear, that has been articulated in this ongoing discussion, that the Shoah will simply become treated in the future, as to some extent it already is in some circles, as just one more example of the barbarism of the 20th century. That it will be grouped along with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Sudan and Darfur and trench warfare, and one can go on and on. This is a common trope already in public discussions of the horrors of the 20th century. The fear, of course, is that its uniqueness will be blunted, muted, and what specifically happened to the Jews during those years will be subsumed under a general kind of history of barbarism, violence, terror in the 20th century. It was a horrible century. There's no question about that. At the same time, others have expressed almost the opposite kind of fear. That is, they've said, well, the Jewish community is too much preoccupied with the history of the Holocaust. It puts too much effort into memorializing it, into creating museums, into creating physical memorials, statues, etc. That the Holocaust ranks too high on the agenda of the Jewish community. Indeed, it looms so large that it forces other aspects of Jewish life to the margins or to the side. And they also express the fear as part of this general fear that it occupies too much space, that it makes Jewish suffering, the death of Jews, the very embodiment of Jewish history and culture. Now, in thinking about these two, not exactly opposite, but almost opposite trends that have been going on, what strikes me is that neither fear is outrageous or misguided, but that neither is completely justified either, and that there are elements of reality that we need to engage behind both of them. First, there's no question that knowledge of the Holocaust will recede with the passage of time. Now, I chose my word very carefully. I said recede. I didn't say disappear. It will not disappear. But the problem is it will share the stage with a mirror, they say on a stage, when I mean literally people's historical memories, not what's in books, but what's in people's historical consciousness of what occurred in the past, with lots of other events from the past. Its exact contours, precisely what happens, the ways in which it happened, the ways in which it unfolded, will become blurred in popular consciousness. And the reason that this will happen is not connected to the shrinking number of survivors. And we already know that there is no necessary connection, because in fact, if you think about it today, there has been no diminution of Holocaust themes in literature and in the cinema, and though every year, with the passage of every year, there are less survivors alive to give testimony. So the Holocaust can continue to weigh upon people's consciousness, those who are open to its memories, without there necessarily being people around who testified to its events. Rather, it seems to me that knowledge of the Holocaust, or at least awareness, consciousness of it, will recede, in part because of something called the inescapable passage of time. Knowledge of all events of the past recedes. Every event becomes less distinct, both on an individual level and on a larger societal level, and in terms of civilization as well. It's inevitable. Part of my fear is that the United States is such an unhistorically minded country that knowledge will recede, particularly more maybe in the United States than elsewhere. And why we are so deaf to history is a whole other lecture. But certainly it's true in the United States. I see it all the time with my students. But I happen to be confident that awareness of the Holocaust and consciousness of the Holocaust will probably fare better than knowledge of other historical events from the past, and certainly the knowledge of and awareness of other cataclysmic events. And the reason for this is that in the United States today, and I'm restricting myself now to the United States, there are institutions committed to the preservation of its knowledge and its memory and its legacy. Many of these institutions were founded by, or their establishment was spearheaded by, persons who themselves were survivors. In addition, the Holocaust has entered into the curriculum of variety of educational institutions: elementary schools, secondary schools, the universities, and a variety of informal educational establishments. So that as a result, we could say that the average American Jew knows more about the Holocaust than he or she does probably about any other event in modern Jewish history. If I look back at the 20th century, there are two events that changed, that are cataclysmic, that are earth-shaking in Jewish history. One is the Holocaust, and the other is the creation of the State of Israel and everything that led to its creation. About the first, the Holocaust, most American Jews have some knowledge. About the founding of the State of Israel, the history of Zionism, what led to the state, the British Mandate, the War for Independence, I'm afraid American Jews are, for the most part, let alone non-Jews, not very knowledgeable. And it's precisely because the Holocaust has become institutionalized in American Jewish life, that in a sense, knowledge of it and consciousness of it will fare better than other earth-shaking events. Certainly, the Holocaust is much more vivid in the lives of American Jews than the history of the creation of the State of Israel. Now, having said that consciousness in the public sphere, among the larger public, will recede, I'm going to say something slightly contradictory as well. And that is, more and more information about the Holocaust will become available. That is to say, we will have more data. We will have more information about what happened in hundreds of camps whose names are not even part of the general consciousness at the moment. We will know much more about the perpetrators. We will know much more about various collaborationist groups. And the part of the reason that we will is that the archives of the Soviet Union have become open for historical research. You have to remember that the Eastern Front, which engaged the Soviet Union, and just behind the lines was the Eisenkopf group and other massacres were carried out. And knowledge of this depends upon access to Soviet archives, which have been closed until relatively recently. In addition, as the Holocaust has become more embedded in American consciousness as a whole, increasingly scholars from a variety of disciplines, not necessarily Jewish historians, sociologists, historians of Germany, historians of Eastern Europe, historians of the Balkans, whatever, have turned their attention to it. And one major impetus has been an increasing awareness among scholars in general that the Holocaust brings to life or makes central some of the most fundamental issues in the history of the modern world. Questions about individual responsibility, about group loyalties, about the deadening impact of bureaucratization, about the capacity of human beings to inflict cruelty, about the capacity of human beings to extend humanitarian aid, definitions of citizenship, who is in and who is out, who is other, who is part of us, and who belongs to another category altogether. Now, these are fundamental questions that engage all areas of scholarship in the modern world. And the Holocaust presents them in an intense and highly articulated form. And for this reason, more and more people will turn to look at it, more and more researchers, more writers, more thinkers, even though they themselves may not be particularly concerned about Jewish history per se. And they will study the Holocaust differently, but not necessarily less well, just differently. Now, there is a paradox here. There is a huge gap, as we now know, between what the scholarly world discovers about the Holocaust and what the public knows. Steven Spielberg probably taught more people, correctly or incorrectly, about what happened during the Holocaust than any book that has been written. Now, they can say that's either bad or good. It's the power of the modern media and the power of culture. Similarly, the Holocaust Museum, which is a little sugar historical ground, will reach more people than the world of scholarship. So, in fact, there is a gap. But it's not as if knowledge is disappearing. Knowledge is multiplying. The task, of course, is how we convey that knowledge to a larger public. But it's not just a problem with the history of the Holocaust. It's a problem that continually frustrates anybody who teaches Jewish history. Where we often find that what the world of scholarship has a particular view of the Jewish past, while the Jewish people themselves have their own view of what the Jewish past was like. And the two are often not always congruent. But what about the opposite fear that I mentioned earlier? What about the fear that the Holocaust is too much with us, that it plays too large a role in Jewish life? This was a concern that was expressed not so much recently, but in the past, and that the problem was that Jews, as well as non-Jews, were being left with a picture that the very essence of Jewish life was suffering. That when you boiled down Jewish history and culture and civilization, it came down to a history of Jewish persecution. And I experienced this in a very realistic way. For the past 30 years or so, I've taught courses on the history of the Holocaust, and I also did courses in modern Jewish history. And you can guess which were the ones that had the much larger enrollments. I mean, not just double, but triple or quadruple. Students would flock to history courses on the history of the Holocaust, but not to a course on modern Jewish history, which would deal with the whole sweep of modern Jewish history. Intellectual creativity, the acquisition of Jewish rights, the growth of Zionism, Jewish labor movements, all kinds of things. So there is that problem that was expressed. Now, it's not being expressed as much today as it was then. That is to say, I think there is less concern, or one hears less frequently articulated the fear that the Holocaust is pushing everything out. It may be in part because certain public events which brought the Holocaust to the fore are in some ways in the past. I'm thinking of two things in particular, which you could multiply the events. One was the distribution of Schindler's List, which was a major event in American cultural history, and the creation of and opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as a variety of essentially satellite museums throughout the country. So, in fact, because the Holocaust, in this sense, makes news less frequently, there's less concern that it is pushing everything else to the margins. I want to end by raising one further possibility that we may not have thought about yet. And it may be that we don't know what the impact of the Holocaust will be because not enough time has passed. That may be strange. Somebody sounds strange. I said we're 67 years from the events themselves. But let me explain what I mean. It may be, and again I am being simply speculative, that neither Jews nor Christians nor the Western world in general is far enough removed from the events themselves to emotionally and intellectually, unconsciously and consciously, rationally and otherwise, appraise its impact, its consequences, its implications. There may be deep and profound ways in which the Holocaust will come to exert an influence on consciousness, on thinking, on creativity, that we do not yet know. Now, why do I make this kind of prediction? What I'm doing is building on a suggestion made by a very famous historian of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, one of the seminal Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. And Sholem himself was a German Jew, although he had gone to Eretz Israel in the 1920s. But he was himself observing all the events that were occurring. Sholem noticed that in looking for parallels, or if not parallels, with earlier cataclysmic events in Jewish history, he alighted on 1492. Now, 1492, you may know, was the year in which Jews were expelled from Spain, and those who didn't want to be expelled had to convert to Christianity. Sholem pointed out that in some ways, I think he thought of Spanish Jewry like German Jewry, or German-speaking Jewry. That is to say, it was, at the time, at the end of the 15th century, in 1492, the largest Jewish community in Europe, certainly the wealthiest Jewish community, one of the most learned, one which had established, in many cases prior to this time, stable relationships with the ruling powers. And it was a catastrophe that was very difficult for Spanish Jews to grasp, those who left in 1492. And Sholem came to the conclusion that it took a century or longer. He said the full impact of the expulsion of 1492 was not felt until the 16th and 17th centuries, 100 to 200 years later. And he saw the great impact, this is how he got onto it, because of the spread of a certain kind of Kabbalah, known as Lurianic Kabbalah, that emphasized the extent to which Jews were in exile. And that the expulsion in 1492 had heightened the sense of being in exile and made them long for redemption. So he also tied the expulsion from Spain in 1492 to the Messianic movement of Shabtai Tzvi that peaked in 1666. Now, I'm not predicting that we're going to have a Messianic movement or a pseudo-Messiah in the case of Shabtai Tzvi. They've all been pseudo-Messiahs, so far as we know. But rather, I want to suggest that I think Sholem may have said something. That sometimes things are so large, are so horrific, are so transcendent of existing categories of thinking, are so out of the ordinary, that it takes a long time now for the whole impact to be made. Now, I'm not making any claim to be a prophet. Historians are bad prophets. Most people are bad prophets. Even those who make a living as prophets, whether on Wall Street or in Washington, D.C., on any of the networks that we listen to. What I want to do, though, is to hold out the possibility that there may be future developments, that we may be wrestling with certain problems, not necessarily 5 years from now or 10 years from now, I do not know. But to hold out that there may be a possibility of future evolutions and developments. And I want us to remain, those of my generation and younger, remain attentive, listening to whatever new themes or emphases arise, because we want to hear them clearly when they make their appearance, and when we want to absorb what they have to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.